This is Michael Barrier. I'll be speaking with you about The Dover Boys at Pimento University, a cartoon directed by Chuck Jones. This is a paradoxical cartoon in some ways. It's very innovative aspects of it, but basically it's a parody of boys' books from early in the 20th century and harking back to the college life in the 1890s. Chuck Jones said this story was inspired by the series books he read as a child, the Rover Boys, Tom Swift, Frank Merriwell, and so forth.
Pimento, oh sweet P.U., thy fragrant odor scents the air.
And a tongue-in-cheek atmosphere is set immediately. You see all this, it seems as though everything is under a sort of mist of cinnamon as the camera pans over to these gay 90s football players and across the college campus of Pimento University.
Out and away, the most popular fellows at Old P.
The narrator's voice may sound familiar if you've seen the goofy sports cartoons that Disney was making in the 40s. The narrator is named John McLeish, who was a John Barrymore-like character not only in his vocal delivery but in his appearance. He was also an artist. The characters in this cartoon are largely of his design. He pushed the character designs in a more stylized, artificial direction than was typical of cartoons at this time. Warner Brothers cartoons or other studios' cartoons, for that matter.
At Miss Cheddar's Female Academy close by.
Oh, shout P.U.
With their usual punctuality, the boys arrive at the...
The characters are drawn and animated in a deliberately stiff manner, suggesting old photos are. In the case of Dora Standpipe, the Dover Boy's girlfriend, she suggests they figure out of the kind of clock where little figures emerge, a kind of Bavarian, elaborate Bavarian clock.
And are soon on their rollicking way. Forced to pass a certain public house, a tavern of unsavory repute, our young friends meet...
Dover Boys, of course, are all drawn as distinctly 1890s types, in effect. These are extreme examples of the college athlete and the studious college student and then the happy-go-lucky chubby boy.
Little do they know that even now, within this very tavern, Dan Backslide, the former sneak of Roquefort Hall,
villain in this wonderful cloud of cigarette smoke. His voice is by Mel Blanc, but Dan Backslide himself is a caricature of Ken Harris, who was one of Chuck Jones's animators for many years and a very fine animator. Did some wonderful animation of comic action.
Escorting Dora Standpipe. Dear rich Dora Standpipe.
Later on, you'll hear another voice that may be familiar, as when Tom Dover speaks, his voice is out of Ted Pierce, who was a Warner Brothers story man, a writer for Chuck Jones and then for Chris Freeling, and for Bob McKimson later also, who did many voices for Warner Brothers characters.
And I hate Larry! They drive me to drink! Confound them.
This strange character who goes by Pierce periodically in the film has a sort of irrational, arbitrary quality to him that it's almost disturbing. It's like, what is going on here? I've never seen or heard an explanation for just what he is. He does play a very necessary role in the film, as it turns out, but he's primarily present suggesting the irrational, the dark and irrational side of this otherwise very sunny and straightforward environment.
No! In here! No, up here!
No, over here!
Over here. In here.
No, in here!
No, in here! Over here!
Over here!
No, over here! Over here!
In here!
No, over here!
I go here!
Over here!
Not here! No.
510, 515, 500.
Over here!
Over here!
Over here! Whoops! Sorry.
You'll see some interesting animation coming up here in a moment when Dan Backslide appears alongside Dora. If you keep an eye out for it, it's what's called smear animation. In fact, Dan will shoot from pose to pose with just one in-between drawing, just a smear of color. It's a very striking effect. In this respect, as in others, the animation anticipates some of the animation that was done by other studios, notably the UPA studio in years ahead. Much more self-consciously modern design.
1250, 1255, 1206,
see him whipping back and forth. And if you were to look at this frame by frame, and I recommend that you do that, it's one of the great advantages of DVD. You can see what's going on. It just adds to the enjoyment, I think, and a clear sense of the artistry involved in these cartoons. But that's a kind of smear animation.
1315, 1300.
The backgrounds for this cartoon are maybe not as obviously advanced as the animation is in some respects, but this was one of the first cartoons that began to have a sense of modern design in the backgrounds as well as in the animation. It was one of the first collaborations of John McGrew, who was Chuck Jones's layout man or designer, and Eugene Fleury, who painted the backgrounds for his cartoons for a few years.
Help! Help! Tom! Help! Vic! Help! Larry!
Something else was happening in the Warner Brothers cartoons about this time as the soundtracks were getting richer and richer. There's more of the smear animation with its amazing distortion from frame to frame. But the soundtracks were getting richer and more inventive, too, thanks to Treg Brown. Treg Brown wasn't afraid to use archaic devices like a slide whistle, which you heard as Dan was driving his car up the mountain road, and also incongruous sound effects like sound of a dive bomber when Dan Backslide is hurtling back down to Earth. I mentioned John McGrew earlier, and I think it's worth including a quotation here from an interview I did with John McGrew some years ago about exactly what he and Gene Fleury were trying to accomplish in the work together.
What I was trying to do here was get something more original in the composition, and by using diagonals and slightly exaggerating the forms.
Mm-hmm.
Because up until then, everything had been very realistic and slightly sentimental.
Mm-hmm. We're talking about Overboy's backgrounds here.
Like this.
Sniffles. Mrs. Sniffles takes a trip.
I am amazed at how much you know about these things.
Oh,
That's the same.
that's the same.
As you can see, we were trying to get away from that pale, washed-out look that the backgrounds had up until then.
John McGrew was a great character of the Warner Brothers cartoon studio, as you might imagine. It had an abundance of great characters, but John McGrew was exceptional. He was in the Navy during World War II, after he left the studio to join the Navy, and then moved to France after the war and lived there the rest of his life, working as a musician. Then after his hearing began to go, he returned to being an artist and painted these marvelous trompe l'oeil murals on the sides of public buildings and stairwells and other things. Commissions, of course. He was not doing it for free. This film, Overboys, was actually a unique film in certain respects. It had a whole cast of human characters, which was unusual, but certainly not unique. But it was the kind of animation of the human characters was certainly unique up to that point. And it didn't really have any obvious successors at the Warner Brothers cartoon studio, evidently because Leon Schlesinger, the producer of the cartoons at that point, didn't care for it. Found it kind of disturbing because it was such a departure from the norm. Despite Schlesinger's opinion, the Dover Boys had a wide and long influence, in particular on the UPA cartoons that came along a few years later. These were the cartoons that made the greatest use of modern design, and people who worked at UPA were strong in their praise of Chuck Jones's example and of the Dover Boys in particular.
And now it is time to say goodbye. Goodbye.